If I say Aries, I imagine that most of you will think of the zodiac sign. Yes, it fits. Probably this is the first image that comes to mind when using this term. However, Aries can also mean the famous siege device introduced by the ancient Romans, and that has passed through time even through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. A system to bring down enemy fortifications or break down the gates of enemy fortifications and manage to enter the fortresses. Without advertising, Aries is also a well-known brand of Italian appliances. And Aries for over 20 years, it is also the name chosen for the latest in chronological order of the main battle tanks, that is, the main combat tanks of the Italian army. It is indeed called Aries, but Aries in the Italian military history of United Italy. Therefore, from 1861 onwards especially remembers the 132nd Infantry Division, the 132nd Armored Division, that was born in 1939. It dies at the end of 1942 after having written pages of history that will remain indelible and that have spanned the times through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. A system to bring down enemy fortifications or to bring down the gates of enemy fortifications? Marshal Erwin Rommel, in his memoirs, has always defined the soldiers, the tankers, the riflemen of the ram as absolute examples of soldiers with the ram. We lost our oldest Italian comrades, of whom, it must be acknowledged, we always demanded more than they were capable of doing with their poor armament. So wrote Rommel in his own memoirs. And there is reason to agree with the great German general. The Ariete has been for many years the faithful companion of the desert, but even more so, it has been the faithful companion of the Deutsche Afrika Korps, then of the Panzer Army. Africa represented the spearhead of the Royal Army in North Africa. It was also the ideal companion of many battles, from the bottom of Cyrenaica to El Alamein. Where would its story have ended? But how was the armored weapon born in the Royal Army? It should be said that while other states, we think of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, for some time now, they collaborated, even if secretly, to develop what would have been the dominant weapon of the battlefields in a terrestrial sense, that is the tank. Elsewhere, I'm referring to France, also to Great Britain. Different doctrines had developed starting from the 20s and especially from the 30s, starting with the cruiser tank, which would have been favored by the British, but also the infantry tank, that is, a tank intended to accompany the role of the infantry and not to act independently. Unlike, for example, the cruiser tank, which needed to work quickly, hit the opponent fast, and then retreat. In Italy, well, the Italian military doctrine, after the Great War, remained anchored for a long, indeed too long time, precisely to the concepts of the Great War. A defensive war to be conducted in the trenches, with a great expenditure of energy, with great attention to artillery, but also to engineering, and a trust sometimes excessive in the infantry on foot. When does the Royal Army have to intervene? In the 30s, starting with the war in Ethiopia, then moving on to the intervention in Spain, up to the invasion of Albania. The La Fattoria plays a central role, in fact, as the absolute protagonist. And it's a period, the mid-30s, when in fact tanks are already starting to make their presence felt. The Italians themselves noticed this in Spain, having to face the BT series tanks coming from the Soviet Union. The tanks provided to the Volunteer Troop Corps will be renamed sardine cans because they are not real tanks. They are tankettes. They are very light-tracked vehicles, barely armored for riflemen, which essentially serve as fast scouts. Their combat capabilities are very poor, if not almost non-existent. This is the serious problem of the Regio Army in the face of modern warfare. It is not up to date. They lack the means, they lack the doctrines, they lack the means because the same armored vehicles are outdated. They are considered only as elements of quick breakage or always quick reconnaissance. They lack the trucks to transport the troops who still have to move on foot, or use the pack animals for the quartermaster's stores and not only. On the other hand, we see armies, the German one first and foremost, but also the Soviet one, then the English one, that are increasingly equipping themselves in a motorized and armored sense and subsequently mechanized. At the start of World War II on September 1, 1939, the Royal Army is obviously unprepared. It's one of the reasons that lead Mussolini to refuse the possibility, at least at the beginning, of entering the war. The Army's General Staff has declared that the Royal Army is unprepared. The Royal Air Force still largely relies on biplanes for hunting, thinking they are still up to date. It will be seen in the first months of war that the calculation will be wrong. The Royal Navy, which is the pride of fascist Italy. On a military level, yes, it relies on theoretically powerful, well-armed, very fast ships, but it lacks air protection, lacks radar, lacks so many prerequisites. But let's stay on land. It's 1939, as we said, and in 1939, the 1st Armored Division of the Royal Army was created. It's the 132nd Ariete. It was initially created in the Ligurian area, close to the border with France. It was kept in reserve during the days of the attack of the infamous stab in the back. It was not used. Initially, the Ariete is armed in its battalions. Tankers with the terrible L tanks, the light tanks, the tanks we were talking about earlier, few-ton tanks that would not stand up to comparison. Imagine with the German tanks, not even with the French ones. The French, among other things, field potentially very good tanks, but with the wrong doctrine of fragmentation. Among the infantry, which are not grouped like the German infantry, little by little, the division at Ariete, which as mentioned is kept in reserve, begins to change, replacing the inadequate L tanks with the new medium tanks, not in the M11S, which performed poorly in North Africa. The M11SS, among other things, are more assault guns than tanks, with the main armament in the casemate and only machine guns in the revolving turret. But it's the new M1340s that are the first real Italian medium tanks, 13-ton tanks lighter than their German counterparts. English, French, but they already have their own operational dignity. With this armament, which is gradually being replaced, the division is transferred to Naples. From Naples, at the beginning of 1941, the transfer to Libya begins. Why Libya? Because in December 1940, the great army of Field Marshal Graziano was annihilated at Sidi al-Barani, a huge, theoretically unbeatable corps of divisions supported, all infantry supported by an armored corps, the so-called grouping. Maletti, it gets swept away in preparation. Tactical errors, strategic errors. There's a bit of everything in Graziani's dispatch. Graziani, who runs at full speed towards the west, passes one after the other, the strongholds. He keeps telling Mussolini, who commands him to halt in battle, that everything is over. And in the course of the escape, he also loses the remnants of the various divisions. Even when the Australian forces arrive under Tobruk, they do so with the M11S captured from the Italians at Sidi al-Barani, on which a large white kangaroo has been repainted on tanks to testify precisely the handover, the new owners of those means, which remain very modest. The Ariete is sent to Africa to attempt the reconquest, not alone, because it will go to support a new German formation. What will become the famous Africa Corps, sent by Hitler to support the Italian ally who is in serious difficulty? Initially, the balance of power is, at least numerically, decidedly in favor of the Italians who rely on several divisions. The best, clearly, is the Ariete. The Germans initially land with the vanguards of a light division. We could call it a prototype of a mechanized division. Then they will also get an armored division, and with few men, few tanks available. At the end of March 1941, the new commander Erwin Rommel launches the first offensive. He justifies it as a reconnaissance. He attacks the British and their allies at Marseille-Brega, at the bottom of the Sertica. The British, who have sent a good part of their material forces to Greece to support the new Hellenic ally, do not resist the onslaught, and after half a day of fighting, they retreat. The Ariete is given the task of serving as one of the 3 points of the trident that must go to reoccupy Cyrenaica. Along the ridge, a reconnaissance group from the German Light Division rises, along with the Italian infantry divisions. A German armored regiment passes south of Gibel and tries to move to Tenaglia, towards the old border with Egypt. Right in the middle passes the Rieta, which reconquers villages, finds the Italian settlers welcoming it until it stops in front of Tobruk. We've already talked about this. The great fortress on the sea that proves impregnable. The cursed fortress on which curses pile up over time, upon curses upon curses. You can still find the video on the channel if you want to go back and watch it. From that moment on, for Rommel, the Rieta is a very precious battle companion. He sees it at Bedefog, where the 4-tank regiment loses much of its forces in battle. He sees it in the First Battle of Bir el Gobi in September 1941, and then during the British Crusader Offensive, which is launched in November. When the Italo-German forces are ready to launch the final assault on Tobruk and are taken in stride, L'Ariete covers the Italo-German retreat back to the Sirtica. He fights at Berkremisa, he fights at Sidi Rezek, he fights all the way to El Agheila and Jerdabia. On December 26, where he arrives with forces now reduced to a lumicino, just 6 tanks a battalion of Bersaglieri and half of the divisional artillery. Very little, however, the division is still standing. An entire cycle of reorganization, rearmament is needed, of course. A cycle that is slowed down by supplies to Italy, which do not always reach their destination. Thanks to Ultra, the British counterintelligence that, using the research of Alan Turing and other scientists at Bletchley Park, managed to decrypt the messages from the German Enigma machine. Thanks to this, the British sink many Italian transports that carry supplies and vehicles to Africa. But in the spring of 1942, the Rieta is ready to fight again. It's Rommel's new offensive, that of Ain al-Ghazala. The source of the Gazelle, Rommel, in May 1942 restarts at full speed and carries out a massacre of Allied brigades. In the cauldron of Ain al-Ghazala, Rommel organizes his Devil's Gardens, the traps of mines and anti-tank guns into which he lures the opposing brigades, tearing them apart one after the other. Ariete is given the task of occupying a Birakib garrison, and it is a garrison held by a brigade of Free France. They are members of the Legion, and not only. Under the command of General Koenig, they fight hard. They fight ruthlessly. The French have arranged a minefield around the Trinchera field. Behind the mines are more anti-tank guns. The tanks of the Ariete, if they don't jump on the mines, are pierced one after the other by the French guns. To overcome the garrison, it is necessary to tighten the siege of Bir Hakeim and wait for the French, now short of water, ammunition, and food, to decide, night and time, to abandon the fortress by exploiting a gap in the field. Migilato. They leave behind only the dead and wounded. It's the same Rommel going to look for the net in the days of Ghazala. He doesn't know where it ended up. He finds it patched up, wounded, but he brings it back to the assault. It's the Bersaglieri of the Ariete who end up first under Tobruk, another time, always that fortress. It's the engineers of the 31st Battalion who go to assault the fortresses of the minefields of Tobruk, to defuse them one by one, to open the way once the fortress on the sea is taken. It's time to chase the English, who are in retreat. It seems that everything smiles at the fortunes of Rommel and the Italo-German army, up to that place that became legend, El Alamein, a word in Arabic that means the 2 flags, El Alamein. The Italo-German offensive stops. In the first battle, the British, although still short of means and reinforcements, managed with a huge effort to stop the offensive. During this battle, the same Italo-German army, the same Ariete, suffers a very heavy loss. The death in Marsamatru of Ettore Baldassari, the commander of the Italian Armored Corps, who, after having reported to his officers during a car reconnaissance, is machine-gunned to death by a Spitfire. It's a bad omen. The Ariete Shakes establishes itself along a defensive line after the Battle of Alam Alpha and heads south, accompanied by the 21st German Panzer Division. And it is here that during the Second Battle of El Alamein, between the end of October and the beginning of November 1942, the authentic sacrifice of the Ariete tankers unfolds. The Ariete arrives at the decisive battle with reduced forces. It relies on about 100 tanks. Most of them are M14S, the evolution of the M13, a ton heavier, but same construction philosophy, same 47 cannon and turret, same flaws. Few self-propelled guns that instead made the difference in the desert. Those self-propelled guns built on the hull of the M13 and then the M14, and armed with excellent anti-aircraft guns, from which the initial muzzle velocity was able to allow the tankers to penetrate the enemy armor. The riflemen are just a company, few yet, even if undermanned, with sometimes refurbished equipment. 6th tabella in good. L'Ariete fights for 12 days, endures the devastating bombings of the British, then withstands their assaults, one after the other, and again. On November 3, when the battle is now at its worst, L'Ariete is covering down south, where the pincer maneuver could take place. Where will the pincer maneuver take place? The day after the British arrive in force, they attack violently. General Arena, the last commander of Ariete, asks his men for a titanic effort, resist at all costs. We need to cover the retreat of the units that are on the coast. Around 3:30 post-meridiem on November 4, 1942, General Arena sends a final radio message to the Italian-German Army headquarters. Enemy tanks erupted to the south. With this, Ariete is surrounded about 5 kilometers northwest of Birland tanks. Ariete fought. There will be no further communications. The Ariete is destroyed. On the spot, the last tanks fight. They fire all the ammunition. They have the riflemen. They start to assault the tanks. Enemies with bare hands try to fight with hand bombs, to climb on enemy turrets to insert a bomb or a Molotov cocktail inside. Following the example of the Folgore boys. All in vain. It's a lost battle. Ariete is destroyed. Very few survive from the massacre. Barely the 13th Battalion survives with a few tanks. Together with the last riflemen and self-propelled guns, moves north. Towards Fuka, the airfield, they are just about 20 overloaded vehicles, in some cases with soldiers, looking for a way to escape from the desert. Another massacre occurs at Fuka. Less than half of the forces survive. What remains of the Ariete finds itself in a new formation, the Ariete Tactical Group, which is formed with the remnants of the Ariete. The Littorio of the Centunisima Trieste, the motorized armored division, had advanced the furthest among all the other divisions. In the First Battle of El Alamein, these forces are reorganized in a defensive sense, even though they essentially have to run away. They go back to Fuka, Marsa, Matru, Sidiad, Baravi, Solu, Bardia, Tobruk, Derna, Benghazi, Marcel Brega, and Lagela. They all go back through Cyrenaica until they reach Sirtika. From Sirtika, they go back up to Tripolitania, and from Tripolitania in Tunisia, occupied after the collapse of Vichy France. And it is precisely in Tunisia that the story of what remains of the original Ariete division ends, which is destroyed in its remains between the end of April and the beginning of May 43. The name Ariete will still be carried forward because later a new division will be reorganized, the 135th Ariete II it is called. It is not yet at full strength. When it is entrusted to General Raffaele Cadorna, heir to the famous Cadorna dynasty, who is given the task of defending Rome. We have already talked about it in another video. Cadorna and his soldiers fight in an excellent, energetic way, but when the higher chain of command dissolves, when the order to return comes, then Cadorna must go into hiding. Join the resistance movement along with many other soldiers, and we have already talked about this too. In the post-war period, the Ariete is resolved another time, again this time, based in Friuli, in Tauriano, province of Pordenone, not far from Spilimbergo. It is there that the Ariete was reconstituted, first as a division, currently as an armored brigade, always the spearhead, now armed, as we said at the beginning, with the main battle tank, which bears its same name, Ariete. A guarantee of capability, of willingness to fight, of resistance capacity, like the animal which, also a symbol of stubbornness, of obstinacy, never wants to surrender. Here is the memory of the first network. It survives today, over 80 years later, thanks to the sacrifice of those boys who died in Africa in a pointless war, or who will sacrifice themselves in defense of Rome at Monterosi, unaware that the king and government had already fled. Today, Ariete is something else. It's a brigade. It's often engaged not only in training matters, but also in peacekeeping missions. And it's a safe bet. The spirit of the tankers, the combative spirit, the pugnacious and persistent spirit, has remained intact from those days. From Eleanor, Maine to Tobruk to Bir Hakeim, to Eno Gazala to Bir El Gobi, up to the present day,